It will be removed automatically. Well, friends, we have been talking about Biographia, Literaria. In my previous part of discussion, we talked about chapter 40, it's chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria. In this part of the discussion, I shall be talking about chapter 14. So here in chapter 14, Coleridge expresses his views on nature and function of poetry. So he talks about the nature of poetry and function of poetry. Now, what is the nature and function of poetry? Let's try to understand it with reference to Coleridge's views as expressed in chapter 14 of his Biographia Literaria. He expresses his views on the nature and function of poetry in philosophical way. So here, Coleridge becomes a kind of philosopher. The poet within Coleridge discusses the difference between poetry and prose. Further, he talks about the immediate function of poetry. At the same time, he talks as a philosopher. The philosopher in Coleridge discusses the difference between poetry and poem. Now, try to understand. The poet within Coleridge discusses the difference between poetry and prose, whereas the philosopher in Coleridge discusses the difference between poetry and poem. And he was the first English writer to insist that every work of art is, by its very nature, an organic whole. It is unified whole, organic whole. It has got its organizational structure. So he was the first. In a certain net examination, such kind of questions will be asked. Which English writer is credited to have talked about every work of art as an organic whole? So the answer would be S.T. Coleridge. He was the first English writer to refer to this. So at the first step, he rules out the assumption. He rejects. He rules out means to reject, to deny, to say no to something, to rule out. The assumption, something which is assumed, something which is taken for granted. Actually, it was taken for granted, it was assumed from Horace, the Roman poet, onwards. What was that? And it actually brought a kind of havoc in criticism when he rules out this assumption. It brought a kind of havoc. What is the assumption? That the object of poetry is to instruct. You might be knowing. We have already talked about these things. We're talking about the development of literary criticism. Horace was the literary critic and poet, and he was of the opinion that the basic function of poetry is to instruct. To instruct means to teach people, to give them moral lessons. And Coleridge rules out this particular assumption. He denies that the function of poetry, the object of poetry, is to instruct. So as a less extreme form of hearsay had asserted, to make men morally better. That is what the function of poetry is, according to Horace and others, his followers. But Coleridge denies this. Means what the object of poetry is to instruct or to make men morally better, means what? To give them moral lessons. Is the function of poetry, is the object of poetry. That was the assumption. And S.T. Coleridge rejected this. So he says, actually, you might be knowing, Coleridge and Wordsworth were very good friends. They were neighbors, and they used to discuss what Coleridge here refers to as the two cardinal points of poetry. You would discuss it with Wordsworth, and he refers to this as two cardinal points of poetry, important points of poetry. The first one is the power of exciting the reader's sympathy. The basic function of poetry is exciting the reader's sympathy. It has the power of exciting the reader's sympathy. How? By a faithful adherence to the truth of nature. By adhering to the truth of nature, by truthfully reflecting the natural things, the nature. Poetry can excite. Poetry has the power to excite the reader's sympathy by faithful reflection of the truth of nature. And second cardinal point of poetry is that it has the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. So you can understand that as a romantic poet, romantic writer, Coleridge gives importance to nature and imagination. The function of poetry, the object of poetry is not to instruct, not to give moral lessons. Rather, the function of poetry is to excite the reader's sympathy by faithful reflection of nature. At the same time, to give the interest of novelty, something new, by using imagination. For example, the sudden charm which accidents of light and shade. You get the idea. Okay? Means such chance effects are the poetry of nature. When you see light and shade, wound, sound and check here. Okay, you get the idea and you understand what poetry is. So this kind of situation makes us understand the importance of poetry. This is what poetry is. When you see something and that makes you feel attractive, charmed, and that is what poetry is. So he goes on talking about these things in this particular chapter. In my next lecture, I shall be talking about the origin of lyrical ballads. Now we should stop at this point.